Okay, moving to Act 1. Act 1 is where most movies begin. When you start a movie and it fades up, you're usually in Act 1. The hero's already had his backstory. There are exceptions, and we saw one with Nemo where we actually saw the backstory, but it's rare. It's not always effective to do it. It's much more effective to engage the audience midstream. But when we get to Act 1, we have to understand that we are not at the beginning of our movie. We are at the place where the hero is now. Their born identity has fallen. Their traumatic event governs them. This could have been something that happened years and years ago, or it could have happened yesterday, the traumatic event. It's entirely up to the writer, and it's entirely up to what the story dictates. But when we get to Act 1, we find a hero who is not operating anymore in their born identity. They are operating in a false identity. They're inauthentic because they have repressed the born identity. They've pushed it down inside where it's safe, where it's in the subconscious, where it's in the soul, where it's safe, where no one's going to see it, and where they're not vulnerable to the fear of the traumatic event. So what does that mean? That means that they've taken on another identity. Well, there's only two identities. We saw that in the first part, the introduction, that there are only two identities. We have the independent and the communal. So if we have an independent hero who has now fallen, his born identity is independent and he has fallen because of his traumatic event, then he has no place else to go but to communal. And communal is going to be the safest place for him because alienation, the fear of alienation that destroyed his identity as an independent, is the very thing that as in communal he doesn't have to worry about. If he goes to communal now, he connects with people and he makes it an attempt and a serious effort to live in relationships, then he doesn't have to worry about the alienation, the fear of alienation. And that would be fine, except it isn't fine. It's not who he is. It is a false identity. And the hero could live in that false identity for the rest of his life very comfortably if it wasn't for one thing. It's not who he is. So there's always an out of balance to who he is. There's always an out of balance. There's no real passion in what he is. There's no real, genuine. He's not genuine about being communal. Yes, he has relationships, but they tend to not work because there's no real genuineness to them. It is simply an escape. It is a mask that the hero is wearing. It is not who they are. And so we come to the part of Genesis 1 that says in verse 2 that darkness covered the face of the deep. And that is precisely what I've just described. Darkness covers the face of the deep. The deep is the born identity. It's been pushed down inside. And the darkness that covers the face is the false identity. It covers the face. It hides who the hero really is. And he does that, the hero does that to insulate themselves from the traumatic event. And it works very effectively for that. We see this in this chart, the independent hero becoming communal, because now by becoming communal, he no longer, or she no longer has to live with the fear of alienation. Same way the communal hero becoming independent, so they don't have to live with the fear of insignificance. But it's false. It is a false identity. There's no power in it. There's no life in it. There's no passion in it. Using our example of Knights and Dragons, the false identity is seen in the plot, which is what happens. Remember, the plot only tells us what happens. It's the story that tells us why, the glory of story, I should say, that tells us why it happens. The plot tells us that this hero in this Knights and Dragons story was once a valiant knight, and he's hung up his sword and his shield, and he's taken up farming. Now remember, we said that he was exiled from the kingdom by the king, accused of cowardice, and so the once independent has now become communal. The fear of alienation, the fear of being judged, has brought him now into this false identity where he's this communal farmer. And so we find him, when the movie opens, we find him very happy. very content, working his land, but this is not who the man is. This is who he is pretending to be, even to himself. He's pretending to be. And that's the false identity. But it insulates him from the fear of being exiled by being part of the community. We see the false identity in The Matrix. The plot is we have Mr. Anderson, who's working a meaningless job for a tyrannical boss. We see the scene where he came in late, just a few minutes late, and his boss pulls him into the office and berates him for it because of this habit of rebellion that he keeps showing. That habit of rebellion shows his true identity, but he's unwilling to go all the way across the line. He wants to be accepted. He wants to be free from that fear of alienation and judgment. Now, in this movie, we are not given his backstory, so we would have to ferret it out for ourselves. We would have to look at the log line for The Matrix, find the story DNA, and figure out what his backstory is, because we're not given it in the movie. So many movies do this, and they just refuse to see the significance, or maybe they just don't know the significance, probably that's the case, of the backstory and how it drives every scene and how it is the very essence of what the hero is on the quest to accomplish. But we don't have it in this movie, but we can extrapolate it. Why this happens, why Mr. Anderson is allowing himself to be berated by his tyrannical boss, is because the one, Neo, who he truly is, has to be suppressed. Because if it comes out, then it exposes him to the fear of his traumatic event, which we don't know what that is in this story.